So that was the truce of God. We were trying to limit the days in which it was okay to fight. They couldn't eliminate it completely, so they tried to limit it. So the Crusades are going to constitute another attempt to accomplish the same thing, which is to stop this warfare between Christians. The Turks had conquered much of Syria. In the year 1071, they defeated the Byzantine army and overran all of what is modern-day Turkey. In 1076, they conquered Jerusalem from the Egyptians, and they began to harass pilgrims, Christians who are going there. The Egyptians had allowed Christian pilgrims to go to the Holy Land and to pray, but the Turks were much more vicious, and so it became difficult for dangerous for pilgrims, Christian pilgrims, to go there. The Byzantines, people in Constantinople, they were harassed. They just lost this huge battle. They were in danger of having the city itself fall. Their whole empire was in danger. They called upon the Pope to give them a hand. You could send soldiers here to help us to defend Christendom against the Turks. During this time, the Normans had already conquered Sicily from the Muslims, and the Spaniards were in the process of reconquering Spain. Toledo, which is about in the middle of Spain, it fell in the year 1085 to the Christians. Spain had been conquered by the Muslims in the 8th century, and now there was a whole process of reconquest going on, which was not going to end until the 15th century. What did the medievals think about violence and war? Well, they said that war is not intrinsically evil. There is such a thing as a just war. The medieval theologians thought that, and the church will say the same thing today. There has to be certain conditions met, but if those conditions are met, you have a just war. St. Augustine, back in the 4th century, had stated the conditions necessary for a just war. You had to have an upright intention, love of God or love of neighbor. You had to have a just cause. It had to be a last recourse, and the war had to be proclaimed by a legitimate authority. So you couldn't go and make war on your own. The church teaches pretty well the same thing today. If you look at the Catechism of the Catholic Church, there's a section there on just war, and these same conditions are there. So one can turn the other cheek if one wants to, but one can't oblige others to do so. And injustice should be opposed. So if those criteria were met and the violence and war were justified, it was seen like someone who's being punished. It's an act of love. You have to oppose injustice. Now, a just cause was considered to be past or present aggression an unjust aggression in the past or in the present. So, and finally, another piece here. Since the 9th century, the church taught that if you died defending Christendom, particularly in Spain, if you died in trying to reconquer from the Muslims the Christian Spain, then you were considered a martyr. So, as we're going to see, the Pope also used this as this piece when he was putting together his crusade. What was a political theory at this time? Well, there were no national states. When you had Christendom, it was like a universal Christian state, like a monarchy ruled by Christ. The popes, the emperors, the bishops, kings were his agents, with each one with his own function. And the enemies of the Christian Republic were considered to be enemies of Christ, its king. This kingdom was supposed to be universal, one flock and one shepherd. It should extend through the whole world, but, and this is very important, forced conversion was never permitted. The church has never, ever condoned forced conversion. There's a lot of accusations about this, and there were forced conversions, some during the Crusades, but never, ever at that was always against church policy and the specific orders that were given to the Crusaders. And so forced conversion was not part of the aim of the crusade, and it's never been condoned by the church. Now, Jews and infidels and Muslims, they were not part of this republic. You became a member, a citizen of the Christian Republic by becoming baptized. So they had no place in it, at least in theory. As the theory went, they had no place in it. Of course, there were some Jews throughout Europe, many in Spain, and there were some Muslims, but in small groups in Europe, but not very many. Now, the Pope wore several hats, and he had several roles. He was, on the one hand, the temporal head of the Papal States. He was the monarch, if you want, of the Papal States. He was also the spiritual head of a political entity. So he was the spiritual head of Christendom. And that was different from his role as the head of the church. Right? The Christendom was a political entity, and he was the spiritual head of that entity, which was basically corresponded to Europe. And he was the spiritual head of all Christians. Now, in the Christian Republic, it was understood that the kings, the civil power, wielded the sword on behalf of Christ. And St. Paul said, "The prince does not bear the sword without cause. He is God's servant and avenger to execute wrath on he who does evil." Now, we all have a totalitarian tendency within us. We all like power. And there was a big battle between the Pope and the Emperor over who was in charge. It went on for hundreds of years. Was the Emperor in charge and the Pope merely his chaplain? That's what the emperors wanted. Or was the Pope in charge and the Emperor was there to enforce orthodoxy as the Pope judged it? That's what the Pope wanted. And it was a constant battle. It went back and forth. But the history of the Middle Ages, in large part, it's a battle between the Empire and the Papacy over who's going to be independent, basically that. So the Pope called upon the secular power to help. And he called it, in the Inquisition, that we're going to see tomorrow, to punish heretics who were found guilty by an ecclesiastical tribunal. And in the Crusades also, then, the secular arm was called upon to defend Christendom. So the Pope called upon kings and princes and counts and dukes to put together armies to defend Christendom against the Muslim danger. There were a lot of Old Testament examples of the people of Israel taking up the sword at the command of Yahweh, obviously. There was none in the New Testament, however, but in the Old Testament they could find a lot of examples if they wanted to get some justification. The Muslims were seen as enemies of Christendom. They had conquered Jerusalem, the Holy Land, Egypt, the Middle East, North Africa, and these places have been the glory of the early church. Antioch, Alexandria, Jerusalem, these were Carthage, Spain. These were, especially North Africa and the Middle East, these were the first churches, the first Christian communities. They had all been overrun by the Muslims. Now, during its first 3 centuries, Christianity had spread by preaching. It was a persecuted religion, an illegal religion. Islam had been spread mainly by the sword, and after the invasion of the empire, Christianity converted the Germanic tribes by preaching. Islam had spread more by the sword. You can't universalize that. There were some Christians who were converted by force, and there were many Muslims who became Muslim by their preaching. But as a general, so you can't universalize it, but generally Islam spread by the sword, and Christianity spread much more by preaching in the first century. Certainly in the first 3 centuries, Christianity was an illegal religion. It didn't have any sword to convert anyone anyway. The Crusades represent a hiatus, a sort of a break in the general trend of Muslim aggression. After the Crusades, which were temporary, then the Muslims continued. They conquered the Balkans. They went right up to the gates of Vienna in 1671. That's the year in which the tide is turned and territory begins to be reconquered by the Christians. But in other words, from the 7th century on, Muslims had been the aggressors. They had conquered Christian territory, North Africa, and then the Middle East, then the Byzantine Empire, Asia Minor, Spain, and they were stopped. But then they were stopped temporarily. The Crusades are a temporary hiatus in that, and then the Muslims continued aggressing until the 17th century, when the Christian armies and Christian military technology, Europe really began to have the advantage, and then they were pushed back by superior European military technology.